Praise be Jesus Christ.
Glory to him forever.
This is
Studeamus.
Studeamus. I am Father Lorenzo Peñalosa. I'm a doctoral candidate in liturgical studies at the Catholic University of America, and I serve as the president of the School of Theology and Religious Studies Students Association, or better known as the STRESA.
And my name is Mariana. I am a MA student in historical and systematic theology, and I am social co-chair for STRESA.
Studiamus is Latin for let us be eager, and we get the English word to study from studere. And so in this podcast, Mariana and I interview theology scholars and emphasize our common goal of being lifelong learners and eagerly praising God through our scholarship. Today, we're very excited to welcome our guest, Dr. Bradley Gregory, who is Associate Professor of Biblical Studies at the Catholic University of America. He also serves as Associate Dean for Graduate Studies and as the Katherine Drexel Chair in Religious Studies. So, Dr. Gregory, welcome to Studeamus.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So, yes, we're very excited to hear more about your research and your academic journey, but we'll start with your current interests, actually. So you've authored the upcoming book, Genesis Through the Centuries, A Reception History Commentary on Genesis 1 through 11, Volume 1. Can you tell us more about that work and any insights about the book of Genesis that you may have learned along the
Sure.
way?
Yeah, so this is a long-running series. I think it was founded in the 90s at Wiley Blackwell. And it's a commentary series that focuses on reception history. So that's beyond the history of interpretation, includes things like art, music, literature, those kinds of things. And in fact, a colleague who used to be here, Ian Boxall, wrote the volume on Matthew. And he approached me maybe 5-6 years ago about doing a 2-volume contribution on Genesis. And I took it on knowing that it was going to be extraordinarily difficult in the sense that I used to joke with people that writing a reception history of Genesis, you might as well say you're writing a history of Western civilization. And so it became necessary to kind of pare down and decide what to include and not to include. I have a particular interest in the history of interpretation, so commentaries from the fathers and the medievals and so forth. But I do have interest in art, music, and literature, probably art more than the others. And so it was a good opportunity to branch out in that. I've taught a couple of doctoral seminars on the early reception of Abraham. So it kind of started to build out from that seminar. And yeah, there's a lot to learn about Genesis. I guess there are kind of 3 main takeaways I came away from with that book. So a scholar named Eric Auerbach, in his classic book Mimesis, has a chapter called Odysseus' Scar. And he contrasts Homer and the Bible, specifically Genesis, where in Homer, I mean, it's great literature, but it's a pretty straightforward telling. And the Bible is what we might call gapped. There are massive holes in the narrative that call for filling in an interpretation. And so that maybe in a way that's not true of, say, Homer or Virgil or other classical authors, it has created this incredibly fecund reception history. And it's been fascinating, I think, to kind of like trace through those. And one of the things that I've sort of discovered is how much the tradition builds off of previous traditions. So you never encounter Genesis just as Genesis. You're always looking at it through a certain lens. One of my favorite examples of this is in the early modern period. If you're looking at artwork of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, one of the things you notice is all of a sudden parrots start showing up in the artwork. And at first you just think, oh, do they really like color, or like, why are they doing this? And it turns out it goes back to a tradition from antiquity where people were puzzled by the fact that Eve doesn't seem particularly put off by the fact that a snake is talking to her. She just like has a conversation with this. Whereas for most of us, if an animal started talking to us like Mr. Ed style, we would be pretty shaken up by that. And so one of the theories that developed in the history of interpretation was that maybe all animals could talk before the fall. And that's why it wasn't strange to her. And eventually people noticed that there was actually one animal that still seems to be able to speak human language, and that's the parrot. And so it took on this notion as like a relic from like a surviving relic from the Garden of Eden. And that's the kind of thing, if you just go to an art museum and you're looking at these things, you would probably never realize how much like the tradition is stacked on itself, going back to antiquity. And I guess another thing I noticed is how interconnected a lot of these interpretations are. So we have to deal with them like as stories, but to kind of go to the other end of the primeval history, one of the ideas that pops up fairly early is that what made the Tower of Babel so bad is not just that they were kind of trying to build it to heaven in a self-aggrandizing way or something, but that they were actually trying to create a pillar that would hold up the firmament so there would never be a flood again, because they didn't really believe God that there wouldn't be a flood again. And so they were trying to like hedge their bets because they were wicked, which is just kind of interesting to me how one part of the story then begins to kind of like influence other parts of the story. Yeah, so it was fascinating. The hardest thing though was to decide what to include and what not to include. And I've noticed that in these like reception history monographs or commentaries, it's become part of the Gattung, or the like literary form, that you have to plead the indulgence of your readers, that you can only scratch the surface. So, but I felt that keenly with Genesis. And in the writing of it, I started to wonder if I was a little bit like the Tower of Babel people themselves, like thinking I could construct a reception history of Genesis. Maybe that was a fool's errand, that you can't possibly do it justice in even 2 volumes.
Oh, speaking of 2 volumes, actually, so will you be involved in the second volume?
Yeah, so I'm contracted to do the second volume as well. I have some of the initial research done on that, especially in the Abraham story because of my doctoral seminar, but I have not begun drafting chapters yet. So that's a few years off. But it'll just be me doing that. And I think that now that I've done volume 1, volume 2 will come more easily because I've been down that road before. I do think it'll be different in a couple of ways. So obviously, if you're doing 12 through 50, you have to be even more selective because that's a lot more text than 1 through 11. Even though, the reception history of creation or Adam and Eve is just massive. But the other thing that I think will be different from the get-go is that in Genesis 1 through 11, I mean, you have your heroes like Enoch and to some degree, Noah, but for the most part, they're cautionary tales about how everything goes so terribly wrong. But when you get to the patriarchs and the matriarchs, a lot of the reception history begins to focus on like, to what degree are these exemplars of faith and morality and so forth. And one of the things that I've sort of already started to uncover is how much on that question different historical eras or even different readers can have blind spots. So people just assume, for example, Joseph was a great moral, godly person, but there are other ways to read that story. And so I think that's going to be one of the more fun aspects of it as well. When Abraham passes Sarah off as his sister, There's a
Mm.
fascinating history of reception. Some people think like he's lying, that's clearly wrong, and other people are trying to like explain how somebody so good as Abraham, well, maybe it wasn't completely wrong. I mean, she was kind of his half sister, so it's not a complete lie. And they come in like with a preconception of the significance of this character or story, and that guides the kinds of questions they ask, but also sort of predisposes a sort of selective viewing of the story itself, discount elements that uh, aren't as relevant to your idea of what the significance of this character is. Um, so I think that'll be an interesting thing to get into, particularly the more ambiguous stories like Abraham passing Sarai off as a sister, or some of Jacob's tricksters, pranks, I guess you might call them, on Esau. Maybe that's a generous word, but I'm really looking forward to getting more into those stories, because one of the things you can do in reception history is you can look at how people interpret these things, and stories like that function as kind of like a Rorschach test, and they can tell you a lot about the people and what they care about just by looking at how they interpret those kinds of stories.
Yeah, definitely. And I know, at least for my area of study, liturgical theology, liturgical studies, one big aspect of that is blessings. And I know in Genesis, at least, there's a interesting aspect of the blessings of the patriarchs, right? I think, and um, it's not the older of the siblings that usually gets the blessings. And so, is that something that you'll be discussing in your book, if I may ask?
Yeah, especially in the transitions to, well,
Mhm.
first the calling of Abraham, but then or Abram, and then the transition to the next generation. There are some interesting wrinkles in the theme of
Mm.
blessing. One of my favorite characters in Scripture, not just Genesis, is Leah.
Mm.
I have a
Mhm.
soft spot for Leah. I can't imagine how painful it would be to be um, second fiddle to your sister, and
Mhm.
to find yourself just unloved and constantly overshadowed by your younger sister. But one thing that emerges very early in the history of interpretation, um, like by the second century
Mhm.
BC, uh, is an observation. This happens in the Book of Jubilees, that when Rachel dies, she's just buried on the side of the road because
Mm.
they're traveling. But it's Leah who gets buried in the cave with Abraham and Sarah, and
Mhm.
then Isaac and Rebecca. So there's this like great redemption story for Leah, not to mention the fact that Judah and Levi are for Leah.
Mm.
So she lives her whole life feeling probably overshadowed and really hurt by the way people treat her. And yet God does so many amazing things with her. And it's interesting to see those kinds of things emerge early in the history of interpretation, because it gives you a completely different angle on the character.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, I'm looking forward to getting into to that. It often plays a significant role as well in Jewish and Christian, and Jewish and
Mhm.
Christian and Muslim relations. What does this blessing like to Abraham mean? And uh, so I think that'll have lots of interesting tributaries as it goes out. But
Mhm.
um, yeah, I think it'll be a fruitful avenue in each of the generations.
Good. And you've also co-authored a commentary on Sirach, right, on Ben Sira. Could you tell us more about this project as well, and other insights that you've gained there?
Sure. So this is an international critical commentary series, which is a super technical, mainly textual and philological
Mm.
commentary. So it's not even really the kind of thing that most, say, pastors would use, or maybe some seminarians for a paper, but it's really written for scholars. So it's highly technical. It's not going to be the kind of thing that is going to do well on Amazon. But I co-authored this with Jeremy Corley, who actually did his PhD here at CUA back in the 90s and now teaches at Maynooth in Ireland. He's a diocesan priest from England. And we've been working on that for about 15 years. And wow. So the manuscript just for the first 10 chapters of Ben Sira it's close to 1,300 pages. Wow. So it's not the kind of like leisure reading you would do. But I think the thing that I've appreciated coming out of that is that Ben Sira is one of the more maybe the most textually difficult book in the Bible. The text criticism is just a complete tangle. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons for that is that scribes are constantly adjusting and even adding to the text. So, for example, the Latin text is 11% longer than the short Greek text or the Hebrew text. And these are additions that crop up in different places. And so we also in this commentary touch on the history of interpretation, which has never been done in a commentary before for Ben Sira. And it is interesting how intertwined the textual history and its history of interpretation are, because it all depends on like what version you're using. There are major streams in Hebrew, Greek, Latin, and Syriac. And especially on the Greek and Latin side, it's like an accordion. I mean, you have very different portions that are found in these. In the Syriac, you have like maybe 12 verses, I think it is, in chapter 1 that don't exist in any other version. Wow. So these books they really are community bound. And the notion that this is canon and yet it exists in multiple forms, kind of like Jeremiah or Daniel and so forth, has provided, I think, a really interesting take on, you can't really distinguish very well between the transmission of the book and the interpretation of the book. They go hand in hand. There's no such thing as like the text of Ben Sira. I mean, you try to get back to close to what Ben Sira himself wrote, but in terms of it being scripture and inspired and canonical, it exists in multiple forms, which to me is fascinating, that God would include multiple forms of a book in kind of the providential growth of the church.
Now, I guess from the outside, since I don't do biblical studies, it seems, the temptation is to think that everything's been written about everything in Scripture. I mean, we have a long, 2,000-year history of reception and interpretations and stuff like that. And yet it sounds like there are still a lot of opportunities. So can you just share with us, what avenues for future research do you think will be the most fruitful within biblical studies?
Yeah, no, you make a good point, and maybe I'll start there. If you write something that's never been said before, you're almost certainly wrong. So you're right. I mean, these have been poured over by so many generations of interpreters, most of whom are far more brilliant than any of the biblical scholars who typically write on these books today. And yet, there's the kind of ancient adage that you never step into the same stream twice. So its function or its role as the lifeblood, the soul of theology, as Jerome said, means that there's always fresh interpretation that needs to take place. So the challenge is not to be so novel that you're crazy, but also not to be so anchored to what has been said before that it becomes boilerplate or just repackaging. And in that way, it's kind of like all theology. Like all theology has to keep speaking to the next generation. And so I'm interested broadly in the intersection of scripture and tradition. I'm not your typical mid-20th century biblical scholar who just like hangs out in the ancient Near East. comparing the Bible to Akkadian text. I'm really more interested in like the Second Temple period and the patristic period, and the kind of initial impact these books have on readers and on communities of faith. One other project that I'm working on now, it's about half done now, is there's a new commentary series published by Eerdmans called the Commentaries for Christian Formation. And this is Jenny Grillo at Notre Dame and Stephen Fowle at Loyola Maryland, and then Robert Wall, who's I believe retired right now, are the editors of this. And the aim of the series is to integrate exegesis, history of interpretation, pastoral theology, not having like separate sections, but be one integrated commentary whole. And they asked me to do the volume on Exodus, and about halfway through that, and that's been really enjoyable to try to think synthetically, but it's also a very different kind of writing, certainly from like the Ben Sira commentary, which, you know, maybe 3 people will read it all the way through, and one of them will be my mom. Whereas this is intended to pitch to a wider audience, but still have this sort of like the engagement with the current state of scholarship. So I'm working on that. That's about half done. The second volume for Genesis will take a good deal of time, but I've noticed that over the past few years, I'm sort of gradually shifting away from wisdom literature. Ben Sira was where I kind of started my career, and I've written on some other wisdom literature as well. And I've kind of shifted more towards theological interpretation and reception history of the Pentateuch, which is why I'm doing this Genesis and then the Exodus. So I anticipate that those 2 volumes will take up a good bit of time for the next few years. But I'm hoping some studies will spin off from that. I'm really interested in the Jacob wrestling the angel story, and its kind of counterpart with the ladder at Bethel, with the angels ascending and descending. So as I get into that, I may end up kind of spinning that off and doing more on that. But I've got my hands full right now, but I foresee for the future, for at least the next, say, half decade or so, I'll be hanging out in Genesis and Exodus and looking at their theology and history of interpretation.
And can you share with us a little bit about your professional journey, where everything that led you to where you are today and the research you're doing?
Yeah, sure. It's kind of a long and winding tale, but I'll try to make it I'll make it quick. So I went to college at Georgia Tech and I majored in chemistry, and then I had a short initial career as a polymer chemist. And I worked in an R&D lab where you come in the morning, you spend about an hour and a half setting up your cook, and then it cooks for 6 to 7 hours, and then you clean up. And so I was sitting at my hood, my station, and in the cook time, I was, monitoring pressure and temperature, but I was mainly just like reading theology and biblical stuff. So I kind of knew that I didn't want to do chemistry for 40 years, but that sort of confirmed to me that I should just do that stuff, since that's what I want to spend my day doing anyway. I liked chemistry, but I didn't feel a calling to it. So while I was still a chemist, I got married, but my wife knew that this was the plan. So it wasn't a bait and switch for me to go back to school. And so then I did a master's degree. At that time, I was Presbyterian. So I went to a Presbyterian seminary, and then was already trending in a Catholic direction and wanted to do biblical studies in a larger theological framework. And that's why I chose Notre Dame, not only because it's the nature of its department, but there were specific biblical scholars there who did that kind of thing. And so that sort of set me on this trajectory. And then, I sort of initially started in the wisdom literature, but I've always had an appreciation for the Pentateuch and its early interpretation. So rounding out that Sirach commentary was a way then to sort of like pivot to this other interest. And so I guess I'm, because of the nature of my journey, I'm I feel very blessed that I get to do what I love. Uh, Everybody says, find something you love and then do that. You'll never work a day in your life. And I guess there's some truth to that, but it's not exactly realistic for, I think, a lot of people, because you just have to pay the bills. And so I do feel very fortunate that I get to do that. But I think having some experience in a kind of a commercial context rather than just an academic context has served me well. And it reminds me how fortunate I am to be able to kind of live a life of the mind, which largely allows me to set my own schedule. And that was super helpful when I was raising children. And yeah, so that's sort of how I've ended up here. I've always taught in Catholic contexts. I've never really wanted to teach anywhere else, because I like that as well, that biblical studies is part of a larger theological conversation rather than being like in a religious studies department. So I'm also fortunate that I get to exist in the kind of environment that I find rewarding both professionally, but also in terms of my faith.
And how would you say that this field has changed since you were a graduate student, and what changes do you see coming up?
Yeah. So I'm of a certain age where I have maybe the most dramatic answer to this question, because I finished my dissertation 2 weeks after the global meltdown, 2008. And so when I went to graduate school, I mean, people actually would decline jobs and wait another year, pretty confident they might get something else. And I mean, those days are long, long gone. Not that everybody, just had jobs thrown at them, but there was an expectation that everybody would probably get a job, if not your first choice. I, in fact, know someone, the generation ahead of me, who never even interviewed for his first job. They just called his advisor and said, "Who do you have?"
Wow.
Which is almost unthinkable today. So just the whole complexion of where theology and more specifically biblical studies fits in the higher education landscape has changed tremendously. To some degree, it's part of the overall contraction of the humanities, but I think it's more severe in our field because as the culture becomes increasingly post-Christian, you have to make the argument for why this tradition matters, particularly in certain ideological camps, which are inherently suspicious of a tradition that has a long history to it. One of the interesting things I noticed is I was interviewing for jobs at the time of the meltdown and just started getting email after email of job searches being suspended or canceled. And the following year, I was fortunate to be able to stay on for one more year at Notre Dame and just teach as a visiting professor. But the next year, between Old and New Testament, there were only 14 jobs. And it was either 7 or 8 of them were at Catholic institutions. Because, right, it's central to the mission. And that's another way I was just very fortunate. I was personally moving towards the Catholic tradition, eventually entered the Catholic Church, but also coming out of a program that was biblical studies embedded within a Catholic theological dialogue really positioned me well to get a job. So I started my career at the University of Scranton, which was a wonderful place. In fact, just talked to a former colleague about a week ago. Great place, but then Catholic University opened up in 2014, and it was kind of like my dream job, or at least one of my 3 dream jobs. And so when I was given the offer, I came here expecting that this would be my terminal job, that I would stay here because, yeah, the opportunity to teach in an ecclesiastical faculty at all levels is a dream come true. Within biblical studies itself, I would say that the field has changed in becoming somewhat more insular in silos. So there's not as much kind of talking across the whole field as there used to be. People like get involved in their methodology or their ideological framework, and a lot of their interlocutors are within that. Not that they're not open to talking to people, but it's just kind of it's ended up that way, I think, because of the diversity of the field, and in some ways, some methodologies are incommensurate with each other, and to some degrees, this has come about a kind of shift in how book reviews are done. So book reviews, at least in my field, they tend to ask people who at least share the assumption that the methodology the author employs is legitimate. And it becomes then difficult to get somebody who might look at it critically, but is not going to dismiss it out of hand. And I think that's somewhat unfortunate, but I think it's just a product of the kind of balkanization of biblical methodologies. Yeah.
So, and one common thread I'll say about your journey is how strategic you've been, even in kind of difficult and turbulent economic situations. It seems like, you asked yourself, what do I want to do? Who do I want to study with? And where do I want to be? And kind of, and had a clear trajectory no matter what was, going on around you.
Yeah, I would say there's a good dose of providence in that as well. I mean, there was a lot of being in the right place at the right time for me as well. I did have sort of a vision of what I wanted to do, and I made decisions based on that. But I was extraordinarily fortunate that the unfolding of massive global changes happen to like place me in really good positions. And I am cognizant of the fact that that is not true for a lot of people. And yeah, I mean, I know people who, did their doctoral work at top institutions and, have never found an academic job. So yeah, it was very fortuitous on my part. A lot of things had to break the right way. And I try to keep that in mind, because today's graduate students like you are just are in a completely different landscape than when I entered graduate school. So yeah, so a little bit of both.
Actually, speaking of that, yeah, now especially in a time of great changes and fast pace of technological change. I mean, with AI, for example, do you see any difference in how we do theology, and especially biblical studies now with technology compared to years ago?
Yeah, I think we're all still kind of grappling on what AI means, in terms of how we do our jobs. I think there's a clear sense in which it can basically be plagiarism and so forth. But I actually just reviewed a book proposal for a publisher, and for the first time ever, the top of the instructions said, please do not use AI to answer any of these questions about the manuscript,
Wow.
which I thought was really interesting.
Wow.
I am a believer that we always have to resist the siren song of taking shortcuts. There are some shortcuts that technology provides, like searchable databases, that actually just help us do our job better. But I think there's no substitute for patiently sitting with texts. And that's something that a machine will never be able to do for you. And it's the kind of thing that you're going to bring to a classroom that a machine can never do for them, which is a kind of cultivation of the soul in conversation with your studies. I also think that we have to then sort of be disciplined about thinking through new technologies and how we're doing our jobs, and be self-reflective about that. And especially in like a publisher perish, which I kind of don't like that phrase, but in a publisher perish culture, there's always the pull to generate quickly. But I would tell scholars just starting out on their career, there's no substitute for quality. You're far better served writing one really, really good article than writing 5 articles that are out of date in 6 months because they were something very narrow and faddish and whatever. So go for quality over quantity. And I think if that's your goal that you're pursuing, it'll help you be discerning about use of things like technology.
And speaking of, as we wrap up, do you have any other general advice for us grad students? Any study habits or tools that you recommend to us? Any professional development advice or time management tips or anything?
The first thing I always tell students was something that was told to me right after I became a candidate, and I've never forgotten it. And it was another grad student who was just finishing his dissertation, and he said, write every day, no matter what. If you get to 4:45 and you're quitting at 5, write down a paragraph. Just write something. And eventually it adds up, and you'll be surprised how useful it is. The danger is we want to like get it all mapped out in our mind or in an outline before we ever start putting pen to paper or finger to keyboard. But you'll be amazed at just being disciplined in writing every day, how effective that will be, both for getting work done, but in your growth as a scholar. So I encourage students to get in that habit, even if it's just a paragraph. The other thing I would say is, graduate students have very different life situations. You've got, some who are clergy and maybe have responsibilities there. You have others who are single, or some people who have families and so forth. For myself, I actually found it helpful that I had a spouse and children, because it meant that I had between 7 a.m. and 5:30 p.m. to do work, and that was it. And so I treated every day like a work day, like when I was a chemist, clock in, clock out. There might be an exception here or there, but you have to have a disciplined schedule. And in doing that, those people who, in light of their life circumstances, worked out a consistent schedule, like every day I begin at this time and at that time, might be an exception here or there, but I have a work pattern, by and large finished much quicker than students who kind of took each day as it comes. I think here at CUA, Stressa has done a really great job of doing the scriptorium. I think, there's something about sitting in a room where you are committed to writing alongside other people. More happens than if you are, tucked away somewhere and every few minutes you check your email or, watch a YouTube video or something like that. So having the discipline to set up a disciplined work schedule. And then the third thing I would say is related to that. It is super essential to have a good work-life balance. It can be easy to get kind of sucked into the work vortex as a grad student, where you're trying to get your scholarly life launched, but you have to have a work-life balance. And there's even a good sort of selfish reason for that, which is that when you finish, if you're teaching in a parish context or in a university context or a parochial school context or whatever, if you have, lived in the cave of the academic library and not engaged with the church or your friends or other social sort of activities, then it becomes really hard to transition back and connect with those people. And so maintaining a kind of like a connection to a world outside of your studies. Your goal should be that when you get to the end, people say, I can't believe how normal they are for an academic. So if they say that, then you've done your grad school years right. I mean, I'm being a little facetious, but yeah, all of those things go together as, you know, the kind of Aristotelian mean. You have to find the balance that works for you and works for your vocation.
Okay. Well, I think
That
this
makes
is a
sense.
good place for us to conclude. Dr. Gregory, thank you very much for sharing with us your current research projects, your academic background, and your advice for us grad students. And as always, thank you very much, Mariana, my co-host and co-producer of this podcast. And this has been
Studeamus.
Studeamus.